Hello, YouTube. So, I'm just hanging out. I didn't really have much. I didn't really have much to say. I didn't really have an idea for a video. But I started to go back and go through some of Levinas's writings. So I thought it would be nice to talk about Levinas for a little bit. I'm always really almost confused by the fact that on YouTube you don't see the name Levinas dropped. In the quote-unquote Great Debate, we see lots and lots of conversations about morality, and how that ties to the atheism-theism divide in one way or another, and it looks like lots and lots of people have signed on to this kind of utilitarianism and such. Not a lot of deontologists on YouTube for some reason. And Levinas is kind of one of the, in my mind, he's very much a giant when it comes to ethics. And well, how can I say this in a little bit more palpable terms? I think when we talk about ethics on YouTube, we're very concerned with laying down specific norms and saying this is what's right and this is what's wrong, and how do we justify that, right? And I think that we talk about things that way because that's how the moral argument runs. And I think a lot of us atheists started to think about the question of morality against the background of the moral argument. And you have people like Tim, my oath of a wingnut, who will talk about ultimate standards of right, wrong, etc. But this isn't how I would think about what morality actually is, or ethics. I don't think it reduces to a question of what's right and what's wrong, or I don't think that conversation exhausts it. I think that ethics really is a question of how do I relate to the world, right? How should I relate to the world? And thinking through that. What is my orientation or direction in the world in which I inhabit? It's a very practical question for me. It's a very immediate question. It's a concrete question. It's not something that's some abstract intellectual wank fest. And for me, any conversation really about saying X is right or X is wrong is just sort of a way of talking about that. And it can be used as a way of cultivating some sense of how I should orient myself towards the world. But I don't think ethics needs to be talked about in that kind of language. I think that it really misses something, right? In some sense, I very much consider ethics to be a matter of self-creation, right? So yeah, this all links to Levinas pretty much just because he's one of the big people, at least on the continental side of the aisle, who wants to talk about ethics and what ethics is, where it comes from, why we talk about this thing. And he's very much interested in well, he's writing in the tradition of Husserl and Heidegger, so he's a phenomenologist. And a lot of people like there's a certain character to phenomenological texts that I don't think people get, right? Levinas, in the text I'm going to be reading from, is he's not trying to really make an argument, right? He's trying to describe something. He's trying to get at. He's trying to sort of. He's trying to describe the ethical experience, right? What it means to be, what it means to be interpolated as an ethical subject, right? And so again, it's a description. It's not an argument as such. But the passage I'm going to read isn't very much about ethics. It's not about that. But if I do decide to go on and make future videos covering later sections of this text, that will become very much central. In this opening passage to his first major work called Totality and Infinity, he starts with trying to describe what he calls metaphysical desire, right? And he talks a lot about this, and usually marks it as desire with a capital D, right? There's something very written about Levinas's text. There are lots of quotation marks in certain places and things, and there's lots of, I would very much urge somebody to actually pick up the text and look at the words. But I'm just going to read through this, and maybe I can say a couple things about it. So this is again the first section after the preface. It's the first section of Totality and Infinity. And it starts, quote, "The true life is absent," end quote. "But we are in the world. Metaphysics arises and is maintained in this alibi. It is turned toward the elsewhere and the otherwise and the other. For in the most general form, it is assumed in the history of thought. It appears to us as a movement going forth from a world that is familiar to us. Whatever be the yet unknown lands that bound it, or that hides it from view, from an at-home which we inhabit, towards an alien outside of oneself, toward a yonder." So you get this first paragraph, and you get this sense, when he's talking about metaphysics, of a frontier, right? Metaphysics is all about going forth as pioneers into some newness, right? Something else. It's about going away from an at-home. The term of this movement, the elsewhere or the other, is called other in an eminent sense. No journey, no change of climate or of scenery could satisfy the desire bent toward it. The other, metaphysically desired, is not other like the bread that I eat, the land in which I dwell, the landscape I contemplate, like, sometimes, myself for myself, this I, that other. I can feed on these realities, and to a very great extent satisfy myself, as though I had simply been lacking them. Pause for a second. So he's saying that there's a certain otherness to food, right? To beauty, I guess you could say, even to the world that I inhabit. There's a certain character of otherness. It's not me, right? The food that I eat is not me. But when I have a desire for food, when I'm hungry, you could say, as a normal person would say, when I have a desire for that, I can satisfy that desire with some particular determinate object. And what he wants to say is that the metaphysical desire, the drive, we could say, that from which metaphysics proceeds, is not that, right? It's not the same thing. It's not something that can be fulfilled in this way. He goes on. Their alterity is therefore reabsorbed into my own identity as a thinker or a possessor. The metaphysical desire tends towards something else entirely, toward the absolutely other. The customary analysis of desire cannot explain away its singular pretension. As commonly interpreted, need would be at the basis of desire. Desire would characterize a being indignant and incomplete, or fallen from its past grandeur. It would concede with the consciousness of what has been lost. It would coincide with the consciousness of what has been lost. It would be essentially a nostalgia, a longing for return. Right? So that's what he says the standard notion of desire is, right? There's a consciousness of what has been lost and a longing for return. But thus it would not even suspect what the veritably other is. The metaphysical desire is not a long to return, for it is desire for a land not of our birth, for a land foreign to every nature, which has not been our fatherland, to which we shall never betake ourselves. So, classical desire is a longing to return. What he's trying to sketch out here as under the heading metaphysical desire is not an attempt to regain something or to return to anywhere, right? The metaphysical desire does not rest upon any prior kinship. It is a desire that cannot be satisfied. For we speak lightly of desires satisfied, or of sexual needs, or even of moral and religious needs. Love itself is thus taken to be the satisfaction of a sublime hunger. If this language is possible, it is because most of our desires and love are not pure. The desires one can satisfy resemble metaphysical desire only in the deceptions of satisfaction, or in the exasperation of non-satisfaction, and desire which constitutes voluptuously itself. The metaphysical desire has another intention. It desires beyond everything that can simply complete it. It is like goodness. The desired does not fulfill it, but deepens it. So, he's saying here that we have this desire, we have this restlessness that isn't aimed anywhere, right? It's not aimed at any particular thing. And in the sort of exasperated, restless striving that this desire produces, we don't get closer to some object that could satisfy that, right? But rather our desire deepens. So it's this very curious thing that he's kind of trying to sketch out. He goes on. It is a generosity nourished by the desired, and thus a relationship that is not the disappearance of distance, not a bringing together, or, to circumscribe more closely the essence of generosity and of goodness, a relationship whose positivity comes from remoteness, from separation, for it nourishes itself, one might say, with its hunger. So again, this desire is kind of, he's painting it like a perpetual motion machine. What he calls the metaphysical desire is something that is self-reinforcing. It's something that kind of compounds itself. And it's not, again, it's not something that can be satisfied even in principle, sort of. This remoteness is radical only if desire is not the possibility of anticipating the desirable, if it does not think it beforehand, if it goes toward it aimlessly, that is, as toward an absolute unanticipatable alterity as one goes forth unto death. So this idea of an absolute unanticipatable alterity, right? Some otherness that is absolutely other, right? And you can't anticipate the content of that, right? And this is what he's claiming metaphysical desire is oriented towards. We are pulled, or we sort of how do I want to say this? We almost overflow towards something aimless, something unanticipatable. We can't, we long for something and we have no idea what it is that we long for, right? There is no determinate object. And our common way of talking about desire is insufficient to come to grips with this mood, right? With this drive. I think it's probably better to call it a drive. Desire is absolute if the desiring being is mortal and the desired invisible. Invisibility does not denote an absence of relation. It implies relations with what is not given, of which there is no idea. You might be able to see there's some theological content in that statement. Desire is absolute if the desiring being is mortal and the desired invisible. Right? You could read this theologically. I don't think you need to, though. Vision is an adequation of the idea with the thing, a comprehension that encompasses. Non-adequation does not denote a simple negation or an obscurity of the idea, but beyond the light and the night, beyond the knowledge measuring beings, the inordinateness of desire. Desire is desire for the absolutely other. Besides the hunger one satisfies, the thirst one quenches, and in the senses one allays, metaphysics desires the other beyond satisfactions, where no gesture by the body to diminish the aspiration is possible, where it is not possible to sketch out any known caress, nor invent any new caress. Right? So, this is a very poetic, beautiful statement, I think. It's not possible to sketch out any known caress. What is a caress? A caress is something that comforts, right? And what he seems to be saying is that there's no way out of this longing, right? Of this desire, right? Of this restlessness, right? There's no way to comfort that. And he seems to suggest that this is the essential disposition of metaphysics, right? A desire without satisfaction which precisely understands the remoteness, the alterity, and the exteriority of the other. For desire, this alterity, non-adequate to the idea, has a meaning. It is most understood as the alterity of the other and of the Most High. Puts that in capital letters. The very dimension of height is opened up by metaphysical desire. That this height is no longer the heavens, but the invisible, is the very elevation of height and its nobility. To die for the invisible, this is metaphysics. This does not mean that desire can dispense with acts, but rather these acts are neither consumption, nor caress, nor liturgy. Right? It's a beautiful line, right? To die for the invisible. This is metaphysics, right? It's a very poetic line. It's a very beautiful line. And there's I think one of the things that he's doing in this text, particularly with a line like that, is there's implicitly sort of the claim that what we philosophers are doing, right? The work that we're doing, the things that we're thinking about, what we're trying to get at, is not some abstract, armchair, irrelevant thing that happens in a university in some dusty professor's office and blah, blah, blah. No, this is a matter of life and death, right? This is a matter of urgency. And it's something that we need to think about and to talk about. Metaphysics here takes a place in the human that's just at the very heart of what we are. It's not some obscure discipline. It's a desire, right? It's a drive. It's something that's very much a part of being human. Okay, and then the last paragraph of the section. Demented pretension to the invisible, when the acute experience of the human in the 20th century teaches that the thoughts of men are born by needs which explain society and history, that hunger and fear can prevail over every human resistance and every freedom. There is no question of doubting this human misery, this dominion the things and the wicked exercise over man, this animality. But to be a man is to know that this is so. Freedom consists in knowing that freedom is in peril. But to know or to be conscious is to have time to avoid and forestall the instant of inhumanity. It is this perpetual postponing of the hour of treason, the infinitesimal difference between man and non-man, that implies the disinterestedness of goodness, the desire of the absolutely other or nobility, the dimension of metaphysics. So, one way to read this paragraph, and I think it's an interesting point to think about, it's one that I've thought about a little bit lately, is that what he seems to be saying is he says hunger and fear can prevail over every human resistance and every freedom, right? He seems to be saying basically the world sucks, existence itself is terrible, right? Or there's some horror in being itself that we can't overcome. And this eventually, I think he starts to identify that with what he calls totality. Right? We all know this, right? This is it's somewhat apparent. Mind you, he was a Jew who was a prisoner of war in the Holocaust, right? So this is very, you can see where this very depressing viewpoint comes from. But so he wants to say that the world in and of itself, just ontologically, is war, and it is fear, and it is bleak and terrible. And what the metaphysical desire is that which cries out beyond being, right? Being is this fractured and terrible thing. Reality, if you like, is this fractured, terrible, horrible thing where eventually fear and hunger will prevail over every human resistance and every freedom. And in that situation, we seek for something wholly other, right? We seek for some radical alterity. We seek beyond being, beyond the reality with which we are presented. And this is the metaphysical desire. And this is why it's urgent, right? And this is why it's necessary. Again, this is a very concrete way to think about metaphysics. Metaphysics and that metaphysical desire is a desire for something beyond the world as it is given. We might say there's hope, right? Almost irrational hope. That's the dimension of metaphysics for Levinas. Alright. So, if people are interested, I'll do part 2. And if people are still interested, I'll do part 3. Etc. Either way, I think it's a very beautiful text, and I think when he gets on to talking about ethics, maybe you could even say meta-ethics is the appropriate word. It becomes very gripping, right? So yeah, I hope you guys have a great night. And oh, one more thing. Also, Levinas is writing in the phenomenological tradition. I will put the Stanford article down below on what phenomenology is. I'm not sure if they have one on phenomenology, but they would definitely have one on Husserl, who's the founder of phenomenology. And he's writing in that tradition. So you can kind of get your coordinates if you like. And have a good day.